All right, we're recording. So I'm Seth Dellinger. When I do these things, I call it the Embodied Dialogue podcast, and I'm with Brendan Graham Dempsey today. But we just decided we want to try to just act like we're in a coffee shop and
And
just
this is the first time I've ever met this wonderful person or talked to him, really. So
yeah,
other
we're
than
like
in your seeing your comments and stuff and posts and whatnot, but so we are,
like a few minutes into the relationship
yeah.
here.
Yeah.
Which is fun. And as I was saying to you, that's something that sort of charmed me about some of these conversations I've run into online. But since we are getting to know each other, I can say a few glossed over things of what I know about you from the exterior, and then see if there's anything else you want to add. But
Sure.
you also have a YouTube channel and put out the Metamodern Spirituality podcast.
Uh-huh.
And I think you're the person that, for me, has done the most to clarify what this word metamodern means. Maybe just because you've often used that word.
Mhm.
I'm aware of a whole community of people, but you know, in terms of these spaces online, I became aware of the work of John Vervaeke a few years ago, and as I mentioned to you, I saw you talking with him, and the sense that there's a meaning crisis, and like, who the hell knows what's going to happen in the future, and what are we going to do about it? Um, but so where I come from is the world of, I'll just use the word embodiment, although I
Mhm.
feel like it's a word that doesn't do enough. Um, and that's the background that I come into this space where there's something called a meaning crisis. There's a way of being in the world that some people are calling metamodernity. And I
Mhm.
find myself saying, huh, I haven't, like, it's funny, like, I'm thinking, like, I'll hear you talking to John, and you guys might talk about Nietzsche, or you might talk
Mhm.
about Plato, or you might talk about any number of philosophers. And when I think of those philosophers, I think, I heard John say that that guy said this, and I heard Brendan say that this guy. So, like, one of the ways I wanted to sort of engage in some of the conversations that you've been having is to just say, hey, I'm this guy who's really curious about all of that. And, like, YouTube is my main source for a lot of this
Mm.
stuff. Like, I have ideas about Heidegger.
Uh-huh.
I tried to read Heidegger years ago, but
Ooh,
I've
yeah.
heard you and Guy Sengstock and John Vervaeke talk about Heidegger.
Well, but this is why we need some people bringing the embodiment aspect
Yeah,
into the conversation too,
yeah,
because it is all conversation idea. I would want to make the point it isn't all that, but it's a lot of that, right? And so there is a frequent concern,
right.
sometimes leveled as a critique, that it stays too much up in the kind of heady domain, and that we need to get more embodied. And I think that there's something to that, as well as I also like to respond to some of that, which with the idea that also for me this like the the conversational and the relational and the dialogical, all that stuff, and the conceptual is a deeply embodied thing as well. But it's only one subset of the modes of embodiment, and there's a whole other set of practices and things that can foreground that much more, and still the talking, speaking mind and all that too. And so anyway, I welcome all that, and it's we need that just as much as we need all the Heidegger and Plato and Nietzsche as well. So
Oh, that's right. Well, and the thing is, like, if I listen to a podcast where there's people talking about these great thinkers and whatever, but then they say something that clarifies for something for me in my
hmm
life, and I, as we say, get an insight,
hmm
that's a moment of embodiment.
yeah,
Like,
yeah.
people say I felt a shiver down my spine or whatever, but it really is like, and that's kind of what opened up for me when I started listening to John Vervaeke more. First of all, I kind of started to understand, and I've heard you speak about this and others, that something unfortunate happened at some point along the way where many of us who potentially would be fascinated by all these ideas were led to believe that it's all irrelevant, and it's just what happens in certain academic
Mm,
departments where people are disconnected from the real world. And
mm,
so for me to hear someone talk about Heidegger, or some of the conversations you've been having recently on metamodernity and you know, questions of religion, and particularly we've talked a lot about the experience of Christianity, which although I always joke that I was raised as a devout atheist, like, well, I swim in a culture that is informed by Christianity. So as I listen to all of these things that could fall into that place that John calls propositional knowing, each insight or each reframing of my world,
Yeah.
it's like now it feels different when I put
Yeah.
my right foot in front of my left and walk down the street.
Yeah.
Because, you know, so that's how I agree with you.
Well,
Like,
let me jam on that for a second, because
yeah,
I totally agree. And when I'm having and when I'm having real generative conversation, I feel this excitement and this thing, like something will land, and I'll be like, ooh,
yeah,
ooh, 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 you know.
yeah,
And
totally.
and what I have gained so much from over the past 5 years being in the sort of metamodern space, broader conversation space, is a series of those moments where, like, over the course of my entire life and learning arc and just general development, I will have picked up a certain set of insights along the way, and I'll have moved in certain directions, and then something will come along that sort of brings them together in some way that's like, ooh, now I can fit these two things together in a way that, like, really affords me, like, an even deeper insight into something. And so there's this kind of like magical moment that happens, where, yeah, these insights become integrated, and you can start to see like the topology of something that can be really, like, really rich and offer a lot of explanatory power and a lot of orienting guidance and wisdom and insight into the way that things seem to work. And that then has the embodied, sort of somatic, you know, correlate of this sort of like, you know, being lit up, and this sort of like, ooh. And I guess I would like to, you know, tie that to this idea of, you know, what Layman, I put out a video called God as Emergent Potential, and I was talking about Layman Pascal's, you know, notion of surplus cohesion. I was drawing a lot on John's work and transjectivity and relevance realization and flow state and all this stuff, right? But there's something that happens when, like, you know, things come together and they sort of help you level up.
Right.
And that isn't, you know, just a heady intellectual conceptual propositional thing. If it's really doing that successfully, it's going to be participatory, perspective, all the other aspects of knowing, and it's going to feel energizing, and it's going to open up new things, and all of that's going to land in a very embodied way, I think. And so that, to me,
Yeah.
I think is like a sacred aspect of sacred embodiment and learning, and it's deeply related to, but not reducible to, just propositional content.
Yeah. No, it's so my training in particular is in the Feldenkrais method, created by Moshe Feldenkrais, and I don't know how much awareness you have of his work,
Zero.
but
So I'd love to teach me, tell
yeah,
me.
yeah, yeah. Well, I'll definitely I'll say so. So one of the things that he says is in every moment we are always simultaneously thinking, sensing, feeling, and doing.
Mm-hmm.
We're doing all four of those things all the time, and I mean those things don't exactly map onto John's four. So what is it? Participatory, procedural, perspectival, and
Propositional.
four
Yeah.
ways of knowing. But they're pretty close.
Uh-huh.
Um, but it's just like, yeah, I'm trying to like grasp the meaning of the words you just said, but I'm also, you know, maybe having an emotional impact from it. You know, and I'm sitting upright and not falling over. And
What
I'm
what were the four things again that we're always doing?
thinking, sensing, feeling, and doing.
And
So,
sensing and feeling, how are they distinguished?
feeling would be more like an emotional sense.
Oh, feeling. Yeah, yeah, okay. Yeah.
Sensing would be like I can feel my butt on the chair.
Yeah,
Right?
yeah.
So I'm having sensory stimuli that's coming in, and of course, uh, sensing and feeling often mix. You know, like I might be sad and have a headache at the same time, and like, which part of my misery is the
Yeah.
emotion? Which part is, you know, the bodily thing? But so there's just and he's written these long books. I mean, the Feldenkrais method is known by most people as a movement practice, as a modality that if I have neck pain, I can get relief, or perhaps if I want to jump higher and, you know, like be the fastest runner. There's things that Feldenkrais can help me with. And at the same time, so his background, he was a physicist, and he also was one of the first ever judo black belts from the West. He met
Hmm.
Jigoro Kano, who's the founder of judo for Japan. And he, at a certain point, kind of looked at how does the human body move most optimally in the field of gravity.
Hmm.
But he also understood it's not just a skeleton, it's also a nervous system. And that person trying to do the high jump might have a traumatic childhood. And, like, so he's got this really deep inquiry into so many aspects of human. And he basically said, the reason I work with movement is if I watch you move, it's so much easier for me to understand what you're about than like
Mm.
if we do psychotherapy and you lie on the couch and tell me about your childhood, you're
Hmm.
still interpreting, but like you either bent your elbow or you kept your arm straight, like, and I
Hmm.
can see that.
Hmm.
And so he worked with people through the vehicle of movement. But what he's often showing us, and if you participate in the practice, is like we try too hard. We're not
Mm.
connected to our whole bodies,
Mm.
or I'm saying everything I'm saying right now mainly because I want Brendan to think I'm smart, not because, like, so I'm somehow performing something that is not the same as what I would
Mm.
authentically do and feel if I was just so he understands how identity is wrapped up just in every single moment, even if there's no words coming out of the mouth.
Hmm.
And so when I then listen to John Vervaeke describing the meaning crisis, and like our blind spots, or how communication is breaking down, there's so many things about it that just
Yeah.
resonate with what I've learned from another
Yeah.
context.
Yeah. No, that so yeah, I'm trying to like make some thread connections here, because one of the things I think that you were interested in, I think you asked this in the Metamodern Spirituality group, or maybe it was in a direct message. It was sort of like, where do you see this plugging into the metamodern framework or something, like, or at least I shouldn't say framework, because for me it's more like there's a set of ideas that people are exploring, that we're swimming in, that and there's a sort of particular way of approaching certain issues that's kind of integrative and complex and all this stuff. But a lot of what I'm seeing these meaningful, deep connections with here is this sense of like multiple parts, interacting. How do I say this? So like, a lot actually of what you're saying is really landing to me, and I'm thinking of it through a U-Talk lens. If you're familiar with like Greg Enriquez's work, and he talks a lot with Vervaeke, and of course Greg and John have synced up, and their things really overlap and mesh very well together. But like one of the fascinating insights is that when you can start to see how all these things that you thought were separate are actually all interrelated. And I think that's kind of what you're getting at, is that it's sort of like, it's not like we're just thinking or just touching or just feeling, or we're doing all of these things simultaneously, and somehow they're all interpenetrating each other and sort of co-informing one another. And we can also then read that happening in people's mannerisms and behavior. We can also see how all this stuff playing out through that lens is speaking to something very deep about people's meaning making, people's, like how people are feeling and the kind of emotional state that they're in and how they're oriented to things in the world and all that stuff. And that provides us a really powerful sort of, yeah, kind of at that point, sort of meta vision into a very complex, well, you could say a complex, right? Like a set of things that are all interwoven together. That one is very informative once you're aware of it, but two is also a way to, if you become informed about it, it can maybe resolve some of those issues and hangups and confusions that people have, and the kinds of
Right.
meaning issues that people are having, and the kinds of disconnection and alienation or whatever that's going on with their entangled lived body relationships, something like that.
Yeah, no, totally. Yeah, no, it's and I'm I'm really happy to talk to you today, partly just because what's so exciting about a conversation like this is I think you already articulated this and I feel the same way. Like it's like we can feel the connection between the things that we have a shared concern
Mhm.
about. But it's like we've got to discover the language.
Sure.
And that process of discovery, I mean, you know, I sort of seen enough of what you do and obviously know what I do that I can have confidence before we get on the Zoom
Yeah.
call to do that. But if we stay with embodiment for a moment,
Mhm.
you know, if you think of politics or you think about the different sort of back and forth you've been a part of on the question of Christianity and its place in the world, you think of all the things that essentially we could disagree about, right?
Mhm.
Well, the body we have in common, right? I mean, sure, our
Mm.
bodies look different, you know, but we all have two arms and two legs, and so that might sound like astoundingly obvious and potentially irrelevant. But if I borrow a phrase from Feldenkrais, he has a book called The Elusive Obvious.
Hmm.
And the word elusive, I think it underlines that because something is so obvious, we overlook it. You
Sure.
know, it becomes our blind spot. And I mean, one of the things that I was curious to ask, I think this is what you're referring to in terms of metamodernity, and I'd love to just get you to maybe give whatever your elevator definition of
Sure.
metamodernity is, but something, you know, that I also see with you and with John Vervaeke or Lehman or some of the other thinkers is just this sense of like why even if you and I are meeting for the first time, like I feel in community just because I
Mm.
see what you all are doing and you're all doing different things, but that there's something about it that's the same as what I'm doing. And
How
so
would how would you unpack that? Like explain, like, or not explain, but like even just intuit, or what sorts of language would you use to connect those things?
yeah, sure. Well, so I mean, one phrase that's out there that I think is a nice general term that we could maybe start with is sense making. You know,
Uh-huh.
we're all trying to do sense making. The world's pretty complicated. It's not easy being human. What's going on, right? We're
Uh-huh.
trying to make sense of it. Um, so, you know, one way we might make sense of it is religion. That's a big discussion right now, especially since, according to some podcasts I heard, a guy named Nietzsche said that God is dead a couple of hundred years ago. Like that's literally like how I experienced that. But it's like I look around and I'm like, yeah. When I was growing up, I had friends who went to church and I just didn't get it.
Uh-huh.
In my household, my family would point at the TV screen and there'd be like Jerry Falwell and these other televangelists who were doing, you
Mm.
know, and it's like that's religion.
Mm.
It's very quick, like, oh, religion is for crazy people who, you know, we're smart.
Uh-huh.
Like I didn't notice the built-in superiority complex. I just sort of took it as granted, we know what we're
Sure.
doing, they don't, you know, and that was like my way of being for the longest time. And then um when I discovered the work of Feldenkrais and I got more into my body, and I even worked in factories for years after having a kind of a middle class upbringing. That was because I was veered into radical politics and I
Mm.
went to Cuba. And but like when I was working in a factory and I was just picking stuff up and carrying it, and I was a meat cutter and stuff, it was like I felt useful.
Mm.
My body. I was
Mm.
doing stuff. I wasn't just trying to prove how intelligent I was to people.
Mm.
I felt more like myself,
Mm.
even though it sort of grew up valuing I'm intelligent and that's
Yeah.
what makes me worthwhile, you know. And then I
Mm.
would hang out with some of my coworkers, you know, from several different countries, and they all believed in God. And it was like, well, maybe I'm the strange one, right? And then yeah, so you're asking how does what I do connect to, you know, maybe your work or some of the other thinkers on the metamodern scene.
Or yeah, or just as you said, like you feel this connection. You see John, me, Layman, whoever talking, and
Right,
you're like, yeah,
right,
I'm
right,
tracking with that, and then
right.
and not even to have to do like a one-to-one comparison or something, but just
Yep.
like I'm intrigued by that because I get it because I see other things, and that's always really encouraging when there's this sort of like independent convergence, right?
Yes,
And we
yes.
all, like you found what was it, Kreisenfeld,
Feldenkrais.
Feldenkrais. um, you found that,
Right,
and
because some
that's
people think there's a T on the end and it's
it.
like actually
It does.
Christ,
It
but
does
it's
sound like that.
K-R-A-I-S at the end.
Gotcha, gotcha. But
So
like
yeah,
that's like one language that you found that like opened up all this stuff, and then like
yeah,
other people will find other languages, and then
right.
they'll be like, oh, and then they find that other people are speaking similar languages, but then they just kind of have to maybe do a little translation process to kind of figure out. But so anyway, yeah, that's been my experience too, and it's just an interesting thing to try to attempt to use our own languages to try to speak to what that experience is.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, and if I slow down a little bit, because I'm having that experience you described, I'm just excited and I'm kind of like I could probably motor mouth forever, so I have to be careful. But so let me attempt my understanding of what metamodernity is. That might be the
Cool. Yeah,
way
sure.
of saying how I might fit in. And you can definitely let me know if you would define it differently. But as I understand it, metamodernity is a, a term that a number of people have agreed upon, given that we kind of have this way of talking about developmental stages of human history. And at a certain point, you had modernity, and at a certain point, you had post-modernity. And it's like, well, I think we're in a new space now. What are we going to call it? And some people are calling it metamodernity. And so that definition wouldn't be even necessarily saying, here's what you need to do to be a metamodernist.
Mm-hmm.
It might be more like saying, well, you're alive in the year 2024. So what are the dynamics that you happen to find yourself in? But then I suppose to be metamodern is to say something like, well, I have a certain understanding of the dynamics of the world in 2024. And I have maybe a certain understanding of how it fits into the larger arc of human history.
Mm.
And because I can recognize certain attributes, like I've got a certain understanding of in this time period how to be most wise in order to have a good life. And so I actually, John Vervaeke recommended a presentation you did once at the Stoa where you sort of walked through
Mm.
metamodernity and some ideas. And one of the things that I remember you talking about is like, we could argue about a particular idea or tradition, like a religion, and we could say, is it true or not? And that's an argument we could have, but
Mm.
we could also notice that in certain contexts, this way of looking at something is useful for this reason. And when I
Mm-hmm.
do that, that's helpful. And at the
Mm.
same time, if I do that, it doesn't mean that I'm claiming it's always true in all circumstances. And
Uh-huh.
and so just that capacity to try on a perspective,
Yeah.
but not take it as ultimate seems to be an important piece of metamodernity. And if I go to, my own work and which is broader than just Feldenkrais, although largely framed by Feldenkrais, one of the things that, I'm often doing with clients is I'll say something like, turn your head to look to the right, and they'll turn their head and look to the right. And I'll say, great. Did you know there's another 20 different ways you could turn your head to the right? Let's explore some of them, and it's
Mm.
like, this one might be good for this one might be good for that.
Mm.
But then what happens is it unlocks a new experience for that person of being in
Mm.
their body,
Mm-hmm.
the point where and it's often a positive effect, um, if I feel more embodied, if I feel just like like you've got that injury to your hand, like
Mm-hmm.
if we could right now just make your hand totally healed, like it would change a lot for you, not just your hand, right? Like
Yeah. Yeah.
the way you showed up at dinner would be different, like whatever.
Mm-hmm.
So that, like, I guess in my work, I assume that there's a blind spot that we all have,
Mm.
but I'm actively looking for how can we,
Yeah. Yeah.
unpack it. Just one other idea that I want to throw in there. I've been particularly influenced by a Buddhist teacher by the name of Rob Burbea, and I don't
Mm-hmm.
know if you've heard of him, the
Yep.
Soul
Sure.
Making Dharma.
Definitely.
I never got to know him, and I'm not a Buddhist. I've never been in a monastery, but I meditate usually for an hour every morning. I'm pretty serious about it.
Mm-hmm.
And he talks about, and I guess this is a phrase that comes from the Buddhist tradition, but ways of looking.
Mm.
So again, like, if I want to impress Brendan right now, that's the way I'm looking at this situation. If
Mm.
I just want to feel whatever I'm feeling and explore, like, a lot of the sensory stimuli coming in is the same, but I'm framing it differently. And so I've learned a lot from him about different states of meditation, the use of what John often talks about is the imaginal practice. This is also something that is deeply embedded in Feldenkrais. So this is something when I heard John talk about imaginal, I'm like, oh, well, that's my bread and butter
Huh.
already, even though I'm coming at it from a different place. But I think the other thing that I think is the case, like when I say ways of looking, it reminds me of what I was trying to articulate a moment ago about metamodernism, in the sense that we could look at it this way, but we could also put that way of looking down, and then we could pick up another way of looking. And then I guess the last thing I'll say, so I can let you jump in, is like, if I get really good at that, I'm probably a little better at that thing where I try to imagine what is it like for Brendan. So that whether I agree with you or not, I'm inherently interested in your way of seeing things, because inherently I can't see what you see. Inherently, there's there's an interest in relationship in that way as well. So that's some of how I would frame my work and attempting to define metamodernism.
Yeah, no, that's really cool. And yeah, so there, I mean, there's a lot of points of contact there and a lot of overlap. And I mean, it's the idea of like an elevator pitch for talking about metamodernism is a difficult thing for probably obvious reasons. I mean, try an elevator pitch for postmodernism or,
well, they ask Feldenkrais practitioners to do the Feldenkrais method in an elevator, and it usually is a disaster also.
So, yeah, but I mean, I think that, but I think you did a great job trying to, like basically frame that, which is that there is, this recognition that over the course of human history, there have been these shifts of ways of seeing, you could say, in a kind of collective sense, and we can call those worldviews or paradigms or whatever. But that certainly people thought about the world differently, in, let's say, like the year one, versus the year 1000 versus the year 2000, et cetera. And that you can track in a meaningful way, the rise of transitions in thought that seem to be responding to previous ways of thinking and then sort of reacting to them and critiquing them and reflecting on them and then kind of doing something different. And you can see the development of like sort of the pre-modern to the modern to the postmodern in that way. And so if you kind of work with some kind of angle on things in that sense, then you can also then view that through a developmental lens as well, as that one thing is really building on the other in some meaningful fashion, because there's some kind of awareness of what this thing is saying and responding to that in a way that's now, it's been brought to consciousness, you could say, and then now is engendering a response, which, just as a one point of contact there, is that we have blind spots. There are all these blind spots, whether it's the other, 9 ways I could turn right, or whatever. There are ways of seeing that are not in our ken that we there. And then this begins to open up kind of really interesting notion that some ways of seeing are seeing more of the ways of seeing. Right. And so you get this meta move that goes on there. And so that is sort of what happens with, I think, like the meta modern frame, or at least that's one way of trying to articulate this, is that this movement from, pre-modern, to modern to postmodern actually characterizes a particular kind of shift in ways of seeing that's sort of accretive and builds on the other in such a way that now that we have enough history to kind of look at, and we can have enough sense of what that process is, we can actually describe that process and then bring that into our awareness. And so when you do that, then you see that this is unfolding in history as a process, and you can talk about it as an object of awareness. And that's what the metamodern in some ways is doing. I want to say all that though too, but I also want to I've been a part of like the metamodern conversation now for over 10 years. And that conversation itself has evolved and shifted over the years. And so, early metamodern conversations weren't really exploring this at all. It was more about like just trying to describe the new art that people were seeing and making the distinction of how that was different from postmodern art. But then in the attempt to do that, they were explaining sort of the process that was going on behind this new way of seeing. Um, and how that was somehow relating to modern and postmodern things and sort of like moving back and forth between them. And then from that, then you get the whole development of this recognition of this metamodern move into a whole kind of theory of cultural development or unfolding that is self-consciously aware then of what's going on in the relationship of the postmodern to the modern and the modern to the pre-modern and this whole thing. And you get this kind of architecture. And and also this is informed by things like integral theory, where Hansi Freinach's stuff was coming out of, and all of that. You can see now why the elevator pitch is so hard. I always, in talking about metamodernism, I want to honor some of that diversity of the whole conversation, because I wrote a book, it's this one here, on metamodernism, where I kind of try to lay all this out, but I also want to acknowledge that like other people are talking about metamodernism in slightly different ways, and it's sort of it's a kind of interlocking diverse set of different takes, I think, on the same sort of basic issue. And maybe that leads to sort pedantic over talking about all this stuff, but I want to always acknowledge that too. But anyway, to tie this back though, I think that what you're describing in terms of this sort of becoming aware of blind spots is a huge key aspect of what's going on here. And again, that kind of interdependent relational dynamics that are always at play in all of these things, I think is another key element. In Jason Storm's work, he actually, studied Japanese culture. He's a scholar of Japanese religion, and he employs sometimes some Buddhist language to talk about some of these philosophical concepts that he's unpacking. And one of them is, I'm going to butcher this, Nisvabhava, Nisvabhava, Nihsvabhava, which is a Buddhist concept that means sort of the interdependence of all things, right? That there is no kind of foundation. Everything's mutually entwined with everything else. And that's another kind of, I think, core element to this way of seeing, which is, that we're always doing all these things simultaneously. And to tie all that together, I think that when you look at the progression of these ways of seeing through history, you could make the argument that as ways of seeing themselves unfold one to the other, they are taking in to what they're seeing more ways of seeing. And that leads to a way of seeing that is very much about perspectives, and it's very much about the complexity of the world and all the interacting parts and all of the ways that things are intermeshing all the time. And so you could argue that there is a certain trajectory to the unfolding of these different ways of seeing, or these perspectives, that they tend in the direction of greater complexity and greater sort of, interrelationship of parts and interrelationship of perspectives. And so anyway, all the embodiment stuff that you're talking about sort of has those elements to it as well. And the fact that we can be aware of all those things requires a certain level of, bringing a lot of parts together and seeing how they're relating. And that, there's a certain way of seeing that prioritizes that sort of approach. And I do think that that's sort of a characteristically metamodern thing, is sort of seeing the coherency in all this complexity and not just seeing like a jumbled mess, but seeing some kind of like symphony or harmony in all of these things that can work together and produce some kind of like new insight and new ways of being, that sort of a thing. Sorry, that was a lot. And I mean,
That's good. I really like the phrase coherence, discovering the coherency in complexity, because if we invoke this term of the meaning crisis or the meta crisis, I mean, I have a daughter who said to me, she's 15 years old. She said to me recently, I really don't want to live in a world where we have to walk around with gas masks all the time.
Mm.
And she's 15 years old. Like, was not something I worried about when I was 15. Like, she doesn't know or probably care what metamodernism is, but that's just like from a 15-year-old on planet Earth these days. Like, so
Yeah.
it is complex. I mean, I think our lives are very complex. I think there's a lot of reasons why, what are most of the movies I've watched with my daughter when we get together, watch a movie, they're like dystopian nightmares. Like
Yep.
we have this conversation going on, which isn't, I mean, we all know why, because we do feel the weather changing. We do say, holy crap, I don't know what's going to happen in the next election in the United States. This situation looks unlike of anything I've ever seen before.
Yeah.
All of that is very tangible. And although there's, like I keep referencing conversations you've been in around Christianity, and some of those conversations have seemed contentious in different places, because, there's this whole history of what Christianity is stood for, and and some people just don't believe there's a God, or some people couldn't understand how you could not see that there's a God, or something. Like people are 100% sure where they're at, and yet this other person doesn't get it, and it just becomes this this thing. And at the same time, and part of what I've appreciated in the conversations you've been doing is I feel like, while being true to your experience and sharing it, I've heard you often looking for the coherence in the complexity. If you're talking to someone like Paul Vanderklay, who's a pastor, and as I understand it, you were raised in a family and were a practicing Christian, but you wouldn't identify that way now. Is that fair?
Yeah. So this is the first time someone's asked me that.
Yeah.
Since this whole topic has come up, whether I would identify as a Christian, and that's I figured it would come up eventually, and it's sort of not to pull a Jordan Peterson,
question, huh?
but there'd be a longish answer that would follow that. So, but I don't want to derail your thought by trying to give that. But yeah.
Well, let's just say you gave me a yes or you gave me a no. Like a lot of people listening would just instantly put a whole bunch of stuff on top of he is or he isn't a Christian.
Yes,
right?
exactly. Hence the need for a long explication of what I would. Yeah.
Right. And I mean, I think a lot of people, anyone who's likely to be watching this is probably a nuanced enough thinker that they're probably cool if you are or you aren't a Christian. But I think we've also all had plenty of experiences of, like, I don't know, I travel abroad and I've been labeled an American before, which is technically true, but it's like, I bristle sometimes. What are you assuming about me? I know how Americans, are seen out, and also maybe it gives me a little humility, like, try not to act like too much of an American. But there's a way of just seeing that all of those labels are there. And so I think there's a way of looking that says, you call yourself this, I call myself that, but there's something that is below that is common, right? And I think embodiment, again, is a wonderful place to go for that. The work that I do, I run a workshop here in Washington, D.C., and I also teach it online. It's called the Musicality of Being, which is a phrase I actually kind of borrowed from John Vervaeke. He often references a philosopher named John Russin, who has a book called Bearing Witness to Epiphany, which that's one piece of philosophy that I've read because I picked up on. But if you read that book, it's kind of like using music as a metaphor for life. Like, rhythms in our life, there's melodies in our life, there's harmonies. You and I talking right now, we could describe it as call and response. And if someone was listening to our conversation who didn't speak English, and they literally all they had to go on was, the rhythmic alternation of my voice and yours, you can start to see where it's more music. And I'm sure you've probably run into those. I always see different percentages, but how much of our conversation, how much of the meaning is not in the words?
Yeah.
So in the Musicality of Being workshops, I really help people tune in to the rhythm, melody, and all of those things. And then, the fact that my hands are moving and you're nodding, like at a certain point, it's happening. But if we get intentional and if we don't feel too silly about it, it's like, what would it feel like if we were dancing? Or you said that and I agreed and my head went up and down, but it's like, I didn't decide to do that. It's like literally your idea resonated in my head and it started my head bouncing that way. And so we can tune into that level. but then it doesn't matter if you're Christian or if you're
Yeah.
Buddhist, or if you're, an atheist. To the degree that we all tap our feet when we hear music, then I'm pointing us towards that. And on some level, someone might say, I'm not really into music. I don't really care about the musicality of speech. That just feels like a fringe thing that it might interest you, but doesn't interest me. The people who at least get over any initial, I don't know why we're doing this, but okay, I'll give it a try.
Mhm.
What they discover is more of a sense of connection and more of
Yeah.
a sense of, like, okay, you're a different religion than me, and I don't want to convert, but I really wonder what it's like. Like we can get into that
Yeah.
place of relationality. And anyway,
Well,
that's where I hear that a little in metamodernism, like when, for example, when you're talking to Paul Vanderklay, you might say, well, from the point of view of history, and like there's many authors of the Bible, and so does that create a certain contradiction? But then later you'll say, okay, but if we put that aside and we just read the stories, what do the stories tell us? And then from like you don't agree over here, but you don't make this disagreement
yeah.
the end all be all of, like,
Right.
so I think there's something that's what I wonder, if my work is metamodern in any way in
No,
that.
no, yeah. So, oh, yeah. Okay. So there's a lot to all that. And it's so interesting because there's both a way that we can sort of propositionally describe these things, but then
Yeah,
there's a way that we just, naturally do them.
yeah,
And this is also really interesting because this actually comes up a lot in the integral conversation space where people will talk a lot about developmental theory and they think that Layman Pascal kind of makes this point that, you know, people may assume that just because they're talking about development that somehow makes you very developed or something, right? But actually it's not about that content. It's about, like, there are all sorts of ways that we can talk about development. And if people say, oh well, if you're not this color, then you're really not doing blah blah blah, then that actually reveals a lot more in the implicit stuff what's going on in the
yeah,
developmental register than what's being talked about. And so it's interesting because we're talking about this right now, and there's two modes that you could zoom in on this topic. At least one is to talk about it in theory, but then there's like the way in, I'll put it this way. So you're right. When I was having that conversation with Paul Vanderklay, we are doing this thing where we can set aside, disagreements and still move on and all that. But then there's the subtext, or maybe it's the meta text behind all this, which is, how do I show up in a conversation with Paul Vanderklay, or let's just
yeah.
say a
Right,
pastor?
right,
How do I
right.
do that versus someone like with you right now? How do I show up in a contextually sensitive way, is kind of the issue. And for me, a lot of that is about embodiment, but it's also about so much of those other, the dancing and the musicality that you're talking about, which is being attuned to and aware of and sensitive to the, yeah, meta communicative aspects of the conversation. And so then that's a whole thing that when you're aware of that as the thing, that it's not just the medium, it's the message, or the reverse, it's not the message, it's the medium, but the medium is the message, right? That's the whole thing. And so those things are happening, and ideally those things are informing one another. And so if someone, well, I'll put it this way, I think that if you're inclined towards this perspectival interrogation unfolding, you're interested in revealing the blind spots, and you're trying to develop those sensitivities more and more, there's probably, that's going to go hand in hand with the kind of content and propositional stuff that we explore in the metamodern conversation space, that they're like propositionally linked, but there's a deep participatory, perspectival, even sort of procedural aspect to those things working, dancing together. um, and it's also then, it's very clear, or it can be felt very profoundly, when someone might be talking all the propositional stuff, but they're showing up in a way that's like, whoa, wait a second, like, that's not, these things don't match.
Mhm.
But
Yeah,
here's a question for you though, so I find this really fascinating around the whole, you know, the embodied aspects of these conversations. Let's just use that language for it. Because, like, the question relates to, how much is that just intuitive? How much do we have to learn that? how much does it become sort of counterproductive if we actually become overly self-conscious about those aspects of our communicative, performance? Um, those sorts of questions arise for me, particularly in the context of a lot of stuff that is playing out in the meta crisis and with issues of how people relate to each other, the breakdown in communication, the isolation, the loneliness, the the various kinds of you know, ways in which, let's say, people struggle with various forms of embodiment, I guess, for lack of a better phrase. And is there something about the ways that we're living now, the kinds of environments that we're living in, or the sorts of relational learning that we've been doing that isn't naturally allowing people to intuit these things and pick them up and sort of just learn them the way we, learn most kind of things like walking or learning to talk? Like, anyway, there's so much in there, but do you know what I mean? I don't know
Yeah.
if you have any responses to any of those
Yeah,
issues.
well, something that I've been thinking about in this conversation, this is something that I think Rob Berbea articulates really well, is that our concepts are embodied.
Mm-hmm.
Our concepts, in fact, our concepts are often the blind spots in our embodiment.
Mm. Mm-hmm.
So, like, if I'm an atheist, which is what I would have said at a certain point in my life, if something happens that suggests something like there is a God, like something miraculous happens, for example, it's like a deep problem for me.
Mm-hmm.
Like, it hurts in my body. Like, my
Mm.
whole being is kind of squinting against what I'm actually perceiving with my senses right now,
Yeah, yeah,
because,
yeah.
you know, I don't know, just imagine you saw someone, it looked like you saw someone flying. Maybe it was just an incredible acrobat in a theater production, but
Sure,
like
sure.
the illusion was sustained. Or
Yeah.
or maybe you I don't know, you have a deep conversation with someone, and some of this non-propositional connection starts happening, and they mention something that feels random, and you discover you're in tears and you don't know
Mm.
how that happens. And
Hmm.
it's like, we could play the tape back and review our life story, and this related to that, and then we'd explain it. But in the moment, it's just like, you said that and I melted. Like,
Mm.
I don't have a place for that.
Mm-hmm.
And what Robert Bea would often talk about is, in meditation, there's often this people think you're supposed to turn off the thinking mind. There's no words in the head. And he would say, just because there's no words in your head, just because you're not thinking right now, it doesn't mean there isn't a concept that's
Mm.
framing everything. So, like, if we go to the Feldenkrais method, like, something that we could say is reality, but we could also just say it's an assumption we all hold, is like the field of gravity,
Mm.
right? We just assume that. But if we could imagine what it feels like to fly, you know, even just we could imagine that, actually we could learn a new way of being in our bodies. We could discover more lightness. Like, if you try the Feldenkrais method, at least for some people, my experience was, I would do this embodied practice and I'd stand up and I'd say, I didn't know it was possible to feel this good.
Hmm.
I didn't know that I could be like this. And I did actually have a couple of experiences, which later I sort of described. Like, I had a conversation with John Vervaeke, and I said, this was kind of like a spiritual experience. I was walking in the factory where I worked at the time, and I had just started doing Feldenkrais work, and stuff was going on in my body. It felt
Mm.
different. But at a certain moment, I took a step, and it was probably just a skeletal alignment. But my experience was that I shot through the roof and into the sky.
Hmm.
And I was like, and it was, of course, it's profoundly disorienting, but it
Well,
happened.
wait, just to clarify though, do you mean your phenomenal experience like felt like you surged up, or do you mean like you actually had the experience of like you were literally up and you were like looking down and you were in the sky?
Yeah, so that's a good question, and it's worth clarifying. I don't think that I felt like I was in the sky looking down, but I almost felt that. What I did feel is the habitual weight of my body, which I always feel and never think about the fact that I feel it, but it's always there.
Mm.
It
Hmm.
disappeared.
Oh, wow.
Like,
Interesting.
my body became fully weightless. And
Hmm.
this is what Feldenkrais talks about. And if you even just have seen some martial arts films, you kind of get the sense of how a martial artist can do something that is mind-boggling in its power, and
Yeah,
it's just
yeah.
total efficiency. I mean, they
Yeah.
might refer to it as chi, but it's like using all the parts in perfect harmony such
Cool.
that the
Yeah.
result is so much better. So we could describe it, let's say, scientifically, and
Uh-huh.
say there's an explanation for why he felt like he was levitating. But the experience, it ruptured my concept of what it's like to live inside my body.
Yeah. Yeah.
And then a couple of years ago, as I was pursuing meditation, and let's just say I had an angsty teenage thing. I had depression in college. I had my own version of the meaning crisis. I struggled a lot. And one of the things that started putting my life back together was getting into the body and doing this stuff. And at a certain point, I said, okay, I've met enough people who are religious who seem okay to me. And like, there's stuff I can't explain. Maybe I'll say I'm agnostic, right? Drop that no God thing, drop the atheist thing. But I had an experience at a certain point where I was meditating, and I reached the end of the meditation, and I was kind of having a not so great day, and I was feeling into the pain of it all. And I just wish someone would come and save me. And then I just sort of said, please, like, please, someone. But then the second I said it, I was like, Seth, who the hell are you talking to right now? And I realized I am talking to some force, as if some force exists. And like, it's weird. I don't even know if that's a conversion, but I definitely stopped even thinking myself as agnostic after that, because what is real is that in that moment, as in my childhood, I would have said those religious people are crazy. And so maybe if someone had a crystal ball and said, one day you're going to reach out to the universe and ask for help, I might have once said, oh, so you mean I'm going to eventually lose my mind? But my experience wasn't that. And then what is 100% true, and I have no doubt, is that my body completely changed in that moment. So I would describe that. We talk about letting go of muscular tension, but I would say I let go of a concept in that moment, right? And my body just like flushed out all of
Ooh, I
this
like that.
stuff.
Yeah.
And so to me, it's like, if you and I talk about religion and you say something that just doesn't work for me, and I keep saying, that's not true. Like, I'm also tensing in my
Yeah.
body.
Yeah. Yeah.
I'm narrowing, and it's like, whereas if I'm opening, and I love like what John Vervaeke calls it, he describes love as a reciprocal opening, but like reciprocal opening is something you can imagine, like two cells reciprocally open and now they can fuse and become something. So I think that's the place that our concepts, like that's, maybe I'm trying to describe a bridge between propositional and participatory,
Well,
embodied. And
yeah, no, and there 100% is. That's why I mean, really gained so much from developmental psychology, specifically constructivist forms like Piaget and neo-Piagetian thought, because the whole idea there is, where do our concepts come from? They come from the body.
right.
We learn that we put things together, and then, basically that's eventually becomes our concept of addition, and so on and so forth. And, obviously that's a very simplistic way of putting it, but basically all concepts that we have emerge by building out of lower level sensory somatic,
Yeah.
experiences.
Yeah.
And so it's very interesting then to think about that, because we build up very elaborate sort of castles of conceptual worldviews and orientations to things that have now become very kind of further distance from experience by means of this complexification process. And then all it takes is having one profound experience that you've never had before, that now forces you to radically reorient how everything is sort of stacked on top of each other, right? And but that just makes total sense, right? Like, and it's not to say that we should throw out everything that we've experienced before, because just imagine, like, we construct our knowledge of the world, over the course of our development in such a way that what becomes our concepts has some really good reliability built in, right? Like, we've done these things a million times. Practice learning requires a lot of practice and repeating things again. And so you hopefully have constructs of knowledge that are based off of sensory somatic and experiential roots that have very good reason to suppose that that is mostly the way things are. But then sometimes things aren't the way that they normally are for whatever reason. and all of a sudden you've got to reconceptualize your world. And I think that that's a really good way of thinking about all of that. And if that can happen in a way that, brings you into greater alignment, greater, weightlessness, however you want to frame some of those positive impacts that can cause to occur, then that's growth, that's transcendence, that's and I don't know if you checked out that video I mentioned earlier, the God is Emergent Potential, but I would be curious if you had, or if you see that and have any thoughts about how that ties into some of this, because that's kind of very much how I think about all of that. And another thing I would say around that, though, is that, a word like religion or religious is like many words, which is that it can refer to all sorts of phenomena, right? That's a one word that you can cram a lot into.
Yeah.
And so once you differentiate that term a little bit, you can also see that there are different ways that people can mean that. And that, to be fair, when you were a kid watching who was it, Falwell or whoever on the television, just because you've now had this experience that allows you to recognize, oh, I'm speaking to in the second person to whatever this ultimate reality is or whatever, doesn't mean that, like, oh, I guess Jerry Falwell was right. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
Like the very meaning of religion expands and can now be meaningfully employed as a concept because of your experience. But your prior experience also holds that you were meaningfully tracking with a certain amount of craziness that occurs in under the category of religion as well. So both of
Right.
those things are true or can be true. And I just
Right.
wanted to throw that in as well.
Well, that's great. I mean, because it's really charitable to my experience, and again, so just the relational aspect of what we're doing together here, I think is really important. And again, I even if I hit on the refrain of what does metamodernity mean, I kind of get the sense that there is some larger recognition in those discussions that I'm seeing under that banner of we all do have different experiences. And
Mm,
even the person who I'm really quite sure is misinformed, they probably have a good reason because they probably
mm.
had experiences and it probably makes sense to them. So even if I think the best thing I can do is help disabuse them of an idea because I think it's going to hurt them ultimately, and I want what's best for them. I still have to be respectful in how I do
Mm.
it instead of barging in and telling them like, "Look, you got it wrong, and here's the real
Well, and
deal."
also keep in mind too, for all the reasons you've been describing as well, that like, uh, even if your goal is to try to disabuse someone of a particular thought that is harming them in their flourishing, you're not going to be successful at that if you just do the thing that you butt up against their perspective and then they constrict and then they get defensive, right?
Yeah.
The only way that you could even successfully do that, if there is any way that that could happen for this person in that context, is to be as open and sort of charitable and meet them where they're at as much as
Mhm.
possible. And like, because that's how that works. And so there again, I think is where these skills that you're talking about of becoming aware of how we communicate, what we're communicating non-verbally, and the sort of meta communicative aspects that go into all of that is actually really important for, yeah, trying to have conversations with people in different spaces coming from different experiences, for all those reasons.
Yeah. Well, so when I was learning the Feldenkrais method, I think my blind spot at that point was like it was getting so much out of like discovering my body and that I kind of was in this cocoon of my
Mm,
body and the environment was not so clear. And I
mm,
often had this experience of like I would do the practice, my body would feel great, and then I would go interact with people and I'd start
mm,
doing self-critical comparison. They're better than me or they make more money than me, and then I would literally even in my body be shrinking.
mm,
Eventually I discovered circling, and that was thanks to John Vervaeke, but also just listening to the discussions around, um, you know, different philosophers, and they saw things this way. And like famously, Descartes saw things in a particular way, and this like shaped,
mm,
our world, in huge ways. Um, just looking at the time we have left, because I know we're gonna wrap up in a little bit, but I am actually curious to jump into some of the more recent conversations
sure.
that you've been having around Christianity, because even without, and I'm totally not qualified, like I'm not intimate with the stories in the Bible. I recognize them because
Mm-hmm.
but it's like I don't even I couldn't make the references that you and Paul make when you talk to each other. But what I see going on, and if I could attempt to frame it in terms of embodiment,
Sure.
if I just quickly drew the arc of my life for you and said, well, it started in atheism and then agnostic, and then I was doing this embodiment stuff, and now I think there's something called the divine. And then, you were raised as Christian, and you said, well, the answer to whether I'm Christian now is like a really long story. Or if I think of John Vervaeke, who, has spoken many times about being raised in a particular Christian context, and now he's not. Now he wants to go on the philosophical Silk Road and find the connections between all these different traditions. Or I think the person who kind of got this big conversation going recently was Jordan Hall, who was a person that I could sort of identify, who looked like, I don't know what, but science and chaos theory and who knows what. He's really a polymath. But then he goes and he's like, I'm a Christian now. And he gets baptized, which whatever else you want to say, being baptized, that's embodiment. It's like I'm dipping myself in the water, and I will hereby be different from and what I wanted to do and just get your response to is each of those trajectories. I used you, me, John, and Jordan Hall, and we could think of others, but they're all trajectories from one worldview eventually into another. And so even if we haven't all landed in the same place, you might say what we've all got in common. And I almost wonder if you would say this is a more common experience in this time period that might be called metamodernity. Is it a more common thing for people to have tasted many worldviews just by virtue of their experience, and to be able to say, or I don't know, like, college students who do a foreign study abroad and they know what it's like to be in another culture for 2 years. I think there's more of that.
Yeah.
And so I just wonder, like, does that in and of itself open up possibility, even if we're not all on the same page, just to say, like, we're all capable of actually shedding a concept and taking on a new one and then experiencing something different.
Yes, definitely. I think that is the essential thing. Or it's certainly a necessary, but maybe not the sufficient thing, but the ability to take multiple perspectives is itself, I think, it's an experience that needs to occur, and that can come about in different ways. And sometimes that can be like a deconstructive process where you feel like your world is falling apart. Other times it feels like maybe you've never quite been at home somewhere, but then you find something and now, something, the switch turned and whatever. But I do think that being able to compare is essential. Goethe was talking about languages when he said einmal ist keinmal, meaning one is none. Like, if you only speak one language, you don't really know anything about language, right? It takes another language to be able to then compare them, and I mean, certainly that was the case, the way it was for me around, like, learning grammar, which, has actually become strangely fascinating to me, and etymology and all these things. But, like, it took Greek and Latin and, these other languages to, like, oh, wow, interesting. And then you actually can then take that and apply it to your own language that you grew up in, and it reveals all these things. And you wouldn't be able to do that if you only had one language. And so I think that the essential aspect to that is, the ability to then work with a plurality and draw certain meaningful comparisons. Now, this becomes an interesting thing. And the other thing I wanted to, as a connection point between a lot of what we've been talking about, is that, again, if you only have one language, that's your blind spot. It's the obvious thing that is not obvious because it's so obvious, right? And it takes becoming aware of it not being obvious, like going to a place where they speak a different language, where you really become acutely aware of your own language and that sort of a thing. And so that I think about as a kind of learning process where we then bump up against something that doesn't accord to our usual expectations or our experience that we can just easily assimilate. And then we've got to accommodate to this new situation, take in more, and then compare and integrate. And that's how we learn and complexify it in our thinking. And when you can do that with whole perspectives, then you're able to get a meta perspective, and that's really key. But the thing that's interesting that you're raising is that, okay, so you can identify that people can move through different perspectives and then they're able to compare perspectives. Great. But how do you explain or account for the different arcs? And how does that factor
Yeah.
into the end product of this process, right? Because, like, for me, in many ways, my arc more or less tracks with kind of classical developmental thinking of like moving from sort of mythic literalism to kind of like more nuanced, sophisticated, rational thought to maybe then struggling with like complexity and the perplexity of relativism, and then finding this sort of ultimate synthesis. And like when I compare my particular arc to classic stage theories of faith or just cognitive development, I'm like, oh yeah, that tracks pretty well there. But then you've got these other instances that you're talking about. Like, let's say you grow up in an atheist household. Well, atheism is a product of the rational modality being applied to, religion. So, but what's interesting though is that when you grow up with that, you're kind of mismatched with your developmental level and the kind of cultural code that you're being enculturated into. Because, like, in many ways, if they were to match perfectly, then you should be getting some kind of mythic literalism at that stage to match your own particular moment in your cognitive development. And if you're getting rational atheism, then that's going to get inflected through that cognitive lens in a kind of, downward assimilated way. And, of course, then you do see the ways that pans out for people. In all sorts of manners. And people, when they become 13, 14, maybe they become militant atheists, right? They're like dogmatically atheist or something. And now this is their identity. But really, that's just like fundamentalism using atheism. And so the whole way that cognitive development relates to the kinds of kind of cultural codes or the pre-modern, modern, postmodern, metamodern moments is really an interesting set of permutations that creates all sorts of really fascinating potentials. And I think that there's something to appreciate in the way that if someone didn't get a particular set of ideas at a particular stage in their life, they may retroactively need to fold that in a particular way, right? So if you grow up atheist, and then but you never got that mythic traditional thing, something might have to fill that. And maybe, I don't know, I'm not sure if this was in the recorded part of our conversation, I think it was, but you talked about you found a certain form of like radical politics at one point in your life or something, and maybe that was a form of fundamentalism that you were needing to kind of fill that particular thing at that point that you, in a sense, needed to deconstruct from, right? But of course, a lot of people will deconstruct from traditional religion and then find radical politics. So it's not about the content so much as it is about the structure, but there are meaningful ways in which the content and the structure align. And I think that there's also something optimal in a human developmental arc of having that alignment occur throughout the developmental process. Now, hopefully that makes sense to people and to you, but it's a very interesting thing. And when you talk about someone like Jordan Hall, that's a very interesting example where now it's like the sense of having come to a kind of mythic traditionalism that I am very curious to see how that plays out, because I'm really curious to see how the participatory and the communal and all of that set of value orientation that I think that, as he talks about in his experience, seems to be successfully fulfilling. I'm really curious to see how that will relate to the propositional stuff that with someone like Jordan in his mind, is that going to create eventually a certain amount of cognitive dissonance where
Yeah.
that's not going to work. And I'm not going to speak to or anticipate anyone's own faith journey or make any statements about that, but it will be an interesting thing to see with a bunch of people right now, even like Russell Brand and Andrew Huberman. Where is this going to be in 10 years? Will all these people still be in the church, or is this a moment as part of their own developmental unfolding where they're integrating something that hadn't been included in the past and now is sort of coming in to kind of complete some of that stuff? Layman Pascal talks a little bit about this in his article, What About Bonnie's Dog, which I encourage people to check out. I think he describes
Yeah.
some of that well. So anyway, I think that that's what I would say to some of that. And Yeah. Yeah. I do think that the last thing I guess I'll say on that front is that um, I do see a trajectory or a direction to this. And I do see that the more perspectives you can unfold leads you to a certain kind of orientation of sense making and a kind of way of seeing the world. And that if your arc is a little bit unusual, let's say, and you wind up landing in traditional conservative doxological faith at the time when for most people in that cycle of the process, cognitively, developmentally, you should be dealing with the multi-perspectival and the, you know what I mean? Then how are those things, can those exist? And what does that look like? And are you actually then inhabiting a traditional literal space or whatever? So that I think is a mystery and remains to be seen. And I don't know, maybe I'm just repeating myself, but I feel like that needs to be profoundly considered. Yeah, I guess that's all I'll say about that.
Yeah. Well, I mean, and I think we're going to wrap up in a minute, but John Vervaeke has this wonderful term, combinatorial explosion,
Mhm.
right? Like when there's too many possibilities for us to actually grasp them all. And, he talks about how that can lead us to dysfunction. We don't want to be stuck in that. But I think another way of looking at it is like there's an infinity of possibilities, right?
Mm.
And, when I think of someone like Jordan Hall, or even I think about it for a minute and then I ask myself, well, what would it be like for me to go to mass this Sunday
Mm.
and sit
Mhm.
there? And like, one thing that I know for sure is I won't know unless I do it. But
Mm.
then there's maybe a part of me that's like, well, what if you go and, everything's different and you don't know what happens after that?
Yeah.
But it seems like there's a certain, like, so I haven't gone to mass on a Sunday, but there's a part of me, even as I say it right now, that's like, well, you should, just to find out. And then like there's another part of me that's like I can
Yeah.
feel an embodiment.
Yeah.
There's an embodied discomfort there that from my experience, if I slow down enough, I should pay attention to what is that discomfort? What does it mean? Whether or not whatever outcome would happen if I go to mass. What I know for sure is like, I think what you can say about the mysteries of life is it's very easy to point at something and say, I'm 100% sure that I don't know that.
Mhm.
Right?
Yeah.
That's the one thing that we can be sure about. And I just feel like we're in this period where like maybe if we're all more honest with what we don't know, that can become actually a point of
Yes. Well,
conversion or curiosity or
yeah. And I totally agree with that. I want to throw one more aspect into this topic though, which is that so I totally agree on the uncertainty bit, and maybe I'll come back to that. But on the issue of, should you just go to mass, or maybe there what, okay, I am of the thought, and the best way I can make sense of all this, drawing on everything that, my lifelong study of these things and the stuff that's brought me to metamodernism and moved through integral thought and all this stuff, is that these different ways of seeing um, that we can talk about in particular cultural paradigmatic modes of pre-modern, modern, postmodern, etc. That there are certain within those modes structures of ways of seeing, right? So like for example, ancient Greek polytheism is a particular structure in the pre-modern mode, right? And yeah, okay, maybe, well, let's just say that, right? And then you can say, all right, well, a particular form of, say, materialist reductionism is a particular structure that relates to the modern, paradigm, that sort of a thing. And there's all sorts of very, I think, sophisticated and fascinating ways that you can account for these sorts of things and explain them, but I won't get into that. But I do think that there's something about the way that, let's say, traditional Christianity is specifically suited for a pre-modern way of seeing.
Mm.
That's what it comes out of. That is the structure from which it emerged. That's the social context from which it emerged. That's the sort of embodiment that made it, all that. Just the whole context of that fits in that. And if you go back 2,000 years, 1,700 years, great, like that seems to contextually fit, right? But with the unfolding then of pre-modernity into modernity and then into post-modernity, you get different living conditions, you get new insights, you get different new structures that now lay on top of that and alter it and sort of challenge it, critique it, and sort of force new ways of seeing. You know, and this has been a big part of what I'm trying to bring to some of this conversation is like, the ancient pre-modern Christianity way of seeing did not have historical critical studies.
Mhm.
That's a new phenomenon, relatively speaking, that now that we have, we can actually say things with not certainty, certainly, but with very high degrees of probability, varying degrees of probability, let's say, that shed new light on what people used to believe uncritically, because they were enculturated into a particular way of seeing. And so my point that I want to make though with all this is that, okay, if pre-modern Christianity is sort of like, yeah, fits right in there, to quote, the Big Lebowski, if that's just like, that's where that fits. And then if you try to take that and put it in a contemporary setting,
Right.
there's going to be something there's going to be off. And
Yeah.
so how would I say? I'm uncertain how, uh, people can land there, if they've gone through that trajectory that we've been speaking about and developed a certain multi-perspectival sensitivity and awareness and are deeply complex and chaotic thinkers with they got all that going on for them, right? Will that pre-modern code still fly,
Yeah.
right? and and
Yeah.
and the main thing I want to throw in here is that a lot of people who go through that arc in the ways that you're describing, that they land there instead of coming from there, it means that they don't know what that particular way of seeing is yet because they haven't had the experience with it. Another big thing I'm trying to bring into the metamodern space is I have that experience. A lot of people who get attracted to various forms of traditionalism do come from atheistic backgrounds, and they say, oh man, wouldn't it be nice if I had ritual in my life or community or the art? And isn't
Right.
that beautiful? It's like,
Exactly.
yes, all that's great. But
Right.
then if you want to land in that pre-modern context with that traditional mode of thought, be prepared for the authoritarianism, for the censorship, for the shaming, for the narrow-mindedness, for
Right.
the patriarchy, for the sexism, for all the
Yeah.
now contemporary pathologies, which maybe in an ancient context were just appropriate, but we have more now. And so I don't
Yeah.
think people who land there are aware of all of that. And I'm very concerned about that. And so
Yeah.
I'm kind of over here sounding the alarm, being like, hey, watch out, people.
Yeah.
I know what that's like. And
Well,
obviously
what I
we're all
hear
on our own
in your
journeys.
concern is if I dare use the term from my place of naivete, it almost feels like a Christian concern. Like if we try to act pre-modern, but we're not living in modernity, that might turn out badly for all of us. And
Yes.
what I get is, on the one hand, that you're working really hard to be respectful and to try
Yes.
on different, but there's also a moment where maybe we even are careful with the word argument, but there's a moment to say, oh my God, people, we might be heading off a cliff. Let's
Yep.
not do that. And so it takes a lot of nuance and a lot of patience to be able to have the conversation where we can arrive there. I mean, I have a friend who sort of made a slightly derisive comment around Jordan Hall's, and she said, "Oh, well, he found the womb again," but like I can relate. I mean, my own story was like what I described was if anything, I let go of unbelief. I didn't
Hmm.
necessarily become a believer,
Yeah.
but that unbelief I had, there cannot be a God, was this rigidity in me. And
Yeah.
so it'd be easy to experience that release as, oh, everything's better now. But
Yeah.
as you said, not take into account the other things and obviously what we probably want is something like, quote unquote, the best of all possible worlds. But
Yeah.
it's,
Well, but this also directly relates to what we were saying, or what I was trying to clarify earlier, which is that religion is a very broad term, right? And
yeah,
that somehow encompasses both Jerry Falwell and the Dalai Lama. Okay, so the experience that you're describing is different because you did let go of unbelief and you found an orientation to a higher thing, and like that's all great. There's nothing irrational there. There's nothing that now forces you to say things that aren't historically accurate, or to radically now change your behavior in a way that enforces some purity code or rejects certain people and all that stuff, right? I'm concerned about people being like, man, I want to let go of this unbelief, and then going towards Jerry Falwell and being like, oh, okay, great, religion. And it's like, whoa, okay.
Right.
So that's my it's a very important, meaningful distinction. And we're talking about a pre-trans thing, and it's like yeah, if it's a good thing, and I hope this happens. This is a whole part of the meaning crisis being responded to, is if people wake up from their nihilism and their atheism and say, hey, there's something bigger going on here, and there is meaning and purpose. And that's my whole project.
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
it's like good for that. But then when it's like, and now we say that, Jesus Christ performed miracles, exorcised demons, rose on the third day and was born of a virgin. It's like, okay, maybe, and I don't want to yuck people's yum at the propositional level, but it's just
Yeah.
sort of like, as soon as you start going down that route, you got to be aware of, the sort of thinking that kind of pushes you into. And then it's sort of like, okay, you may have found the womb, but is it in a cult? And is
Right.
it in a context that's going to hurt you and your family and the world?
Right.
So
Right.
that's what I'm
Right.
trying to do in as nice a way as I possibly can, and as non-argumentative as a way as I possibly can. But it's like, that's been a huge struggle for me in all this, because like inside I'm like, oh no, but like outside I'm like,
Yeah.
oh, that's one way of seeing it.
Yeah. Yeah, no, it
So,
comes through. It comes through. I get a real sense of care for you, and it even comes through in the urgency that you intervene to clarify something, because it's like, wait, I don't want us to get hurt or something like that. My hope is that as I sort of said it before, that like the musicality of language, or just the experience
yeah,
of my butt on the chair while we have this conversation, that there actually is something there, that it doesn't matter what religion you are or whatnot.
yeah,
And just, I mean, this would probably be another whole conversation. I think you're probably at
yeah, I
your
gotta go
time.
soon.
But like, I think that the body and embodiment is also very connected to the imaginal. Um, so I had a conversation with a friend who had done a lot of research on the history of somatics, like Feldenkrais, and one of his conclusions was basically like, somatics bridges science and spirituality,
Mm. Hmm.
because I said before, I felt things in my body that I had never felt before.
Yeah,
And it's very concrete, but it also changes what I'm willing to think, because
yeah,
I'm, have, and I would just submit, maybe like, I've seen some of the poetic work that you've done around God. Like, so art
mm.
could be similar. It's like, let's go
Yeah,
into the imaginal, and what would it
100%.
feel like if, God was my father and he died, and I went and, carried him, which is part of, just referencing something you wrote. But it's like, it allows me to feel something without declaring that it's the truth. But
Right.
that feeling that I was allowed to feel reveals something that I wouldn't know unless I'd
Yeah.
felt it. So I guess that's my hope for embodiment practices in this conversation, is that there's the potential
Mm.
that they almost could play a diplomatic role, or some sort of common ground,
Totally.
where the person who identifies as this and the person who identifies as that could actually meet and have an experience of being together.
100%. And I mean, I think because it's sort of, even though it does this, as we were talking about before, tie into the propositional, it's the source of the propositional, it at the same time remains non-propositional, right? So whether you believe in, Krishna or Jesus or, what have you, we can all get aligned in a certain way that makes us a roof, potentially. And
Yeah.
if we can do that, then we can all be like, hey, that, there's something happening here. And then we can start being like, let me see your perspective on that and your perspective on that. Now, if we come up with to someone and they say, you did what? Oh, that's definitely Satan. No, 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 that's evil. That's no good.
Right.
Then
Right.
that's a good sign that like maybe that's not taking in that perspective approach to things. And then we're being closed off from things. And so, yeah, that's
That seems to be the one thing that we really have to move beyond, is the
mhm.
assertion of other people's experiences, which seems to be rife in so many of religious traditions.
Just as a funny thing that happened, I was after my PVK, my conversation with Paul Vanderklay, there's a bunch of comments and everything. And someone commented, oh, sure, but do we believe he's accurate on all this or something? This was I'd given my own autobiography, right? And
Right.
someone says, do we believe him? And I just questioned and tried very hard to be like, what do you mean by that? And
Right.
then the
Right.
response was like, I basically said, do you think I made this up for people to like me here? And he's like, essentially, yeah. And so I just thought it was amazing that some folks will try so hard to defend their way of seeing, that they will actually go out so far as to say that a person's lived experience that they're communicating, they are being disingenuous about. And
Yeah,
how incredibly, again, like hurtful and just like in bad faith that is. And
right.
so this is what, again, is sort of the guiding star, I think, of a metamodern approach is like, what perspectives are we able to cognize? How
Yeah,
many are we able to be taking seriously, right? That if you find yourself constricting, you're probably constricting also on the kinds of perspectives you're allowing yourself to be open to, and you're living in the blind spot. Basically, you're like, don't rob me of my blind spot. And so if there is something that I am trying to help people avoid in navigating returns of religion, it's it's landing in a spot that turns them off to trying to take in more perspectives. And so that's just what I feel like I can maybe uniquely offer into the space because of my experience in religious traditions that are so dogmatically anti-perspectival.
yeah, yeah.
But anyway,
Well,
yeah,
this was really great, Brendan. I appreciate you taking the time. And
yeah,
just
man, this
on
is great.
that last point, I mean, just to say, your work has been among the things that I've encountered in recent years that has allowed me to let go of some of my things I was so sure about that I later discovered were actually more like constrictions or blind spots that were, limiting my freedom of movement. So I really get a strong sense that everything you're doing really comes from good faith. And
Thank you.
I think uh and just to make a more general point, like the discussion about religion, it's relevant if you're trying to find more comfort in your body. Like
Mm,
these things are
yeah,
connected. And so that's
yeah,
why I wanted to talk to you about all this stuff. And
yeah. No,
anyways,
this was great. I am glad we probably at this point had multiple cups of coffee at this coffee house. Uh,
yeah,
and the last thing I'll say is I'm sure that I still have blind spots, and I know that I do, and I'm sure people watching this and me speaking will be aware of them in a way that I'm not, and so I want to own that too. And I can only hope that over the next 10 and 20 or however many years, I can continue to learn all the ways that I'm currently wrong, and that'll be fun. And that I invite the insight from others, that can speed the process along. So anyway,
totally.
but this was really wonderful. I really appreciate you facilitating this, and it was a great convo.
Right on. Well, we'll
Cool.
have to do it again sometime.
Sounds good. All right.